Among the great estates of England, the grandest gates were rarely built to keep strangers out. More often, they stood as silent reminders that kindness itself was expected to remain outside. Nobles measured worth through titles, fortunes, and bloodlines, while those who served them learned to lower their eyes and disappear into the background. Yet history has always favored the rare soul who pauses where everyone else hurries past, for a single unnoticed act of compassion can alter lives more completely than the loudest declaration ever spoken. Early autumn settled gently across Ashcombe Hall, a sprawling estate nestled among rolling hills in the English countryside. Mist clung to ancient oaks, and the morning sun struggled through drifting clouds, leaving pearls of dew upon the carefully trimmed hedges. Servants hurried across gravel paths carrying baskets of flowers, polished silver trays, and lengths of crimson ribbon. Every window of the manor gleamed. Every fireplace had been lit. Inside, musicians tuned their instruments while cooks filled the kitchens with the comforting aromas of fresh bread and roasted meats. The household prepared for an afternoon gathering unlike any held in recent years. Lady Beatrice Ashcroft had invited neighbouring noble families to celebrate the completion of Ashcombe Hall's magnificent restoration. Though announced as a simple autumn reception, whispers throughout the county suggested another purpose. Many believed the gathering offered ambitious families an opportunity to introduce their unmarried daughters to the elusive Earl of Blackwood, whose wealth, influence, and refusal to court anyone had become the subject of endless conversation. Carriages began arriving long before noon. Ladies descended in gowns stitched with delicate lace and shimmering silk, their mothers quietly rehearsing polished smiles and carefully chosen compliments. Gentlemen discussed estates, politics, and profitable harvests, while pretending not to notice the hopeful glances exchanged across the marble entrance hall. Beyond the wrought iron gates, however, none of the excitement reached the elderly gatekeeper standing faithfully beneath the stone archway. His coat showed signs of years spent in every season England could offer. Rain had darkened the faded wool countless times, and the polished brass buttons no longer shone as brightly as those worn by younger servants inside. He greeted every arriving carriage with the same courteous nod before opening the heavy gates, never lingering long enough to receive acknowledgement. Most visitors scarcely looked at him. Some offered impatient gestures for him to move faster. Others spoke around him as though he were another piece of the estate's architecture. Hour after hour, he remained at his post beneath the weakening autumn sun, watching laughter disappear into the grand house while dust from carriage wheels settled quietly upon his worn boots. Inside Ashcombe Hall, conversations drifted from one glittering room to another, each filled with calculated charm and carefully rehearsed elegance. No one wondered whether the old gatekeeper had eaten. No one noticed how often he paused to steady himself against the weathered stone pillar beside the gate. And no one imagined that before the day reached its end, the smallest act of kindness offered at those gates would become the single moment every guest would remember for the rest of their lives. Miss Eleanor Hart had lived at Ashcombe Hall for nearly 6 years, though few guests would have guessed she belonged to the household. She was Lady Beatrice Ashcroft's late cousin's daughter, taken in after fever claimed both her parents before she reached 18. The arrangement provided shelter but little affection. Lady Beatrice often reminded everyone that Eleanor should be grateful for charity, a word spoken so frequently that it had become another name for obligation. Unlike the fashionable young ladies bustling through the manor, Eleanor owned only a handful of modest dresses, each carefully mended by her own hands. While other women prepared for dances and introductions, she spent her mornings organizing the household library, tending neglected flower beds, or assisting elderly servants whose aching joints slowed their work. She never complained. She simply noticed what others overlooked. That quiet gift had earned the affection of nearly every servant at Ashcombe Hall. The cook secretly saved her the warmest loaf from each morning's baking. The housekeeper trusted her with delicate family heirlooms. Even the stable boys smiled whenever she crossed the courtyard, knowing she remembered each horse by name. Yet among the noble guests, Eleanor was almost invisible. Lady Beatrice insisted she remain useful rather than noticeable. "Do remember your place," she reminded Eleanor as preparations reached their busiest hour. "Smile politely if addressed, but do not linger among the guests. There are daughters here seeking distinguished husbands. No one has come to admire a poor relation." Eleanor merely inclined her head. "I understand, Aunt." Lady Beatrice swept away without another glance. Across the room, her cousins, Clara and Vivian Ashcroft, exchanged satisfied smiles. Dressed in gowns of pale blue and emerald silk, they spent the morning debating which jewels best complemented their eyes and whether the mysterious Earl of Blackwood preferred wit or beauty. "I've heard he scarcely smiles," Clara whispered. Then I'll simply give him a reason, Vivian replied with confident amusement. Their laughter echoed down the corridor. Eleanor quietly gathered a basket of fresh linens and slipped through the servants' passage toward the kitchens. She preferred those hidden corridors. There, people spoke honestly. No one competed for attention. No one measured another's worth by titles. Later that afternoon, while carrying fresh herbs from the kitchen garden, Eleanor noticed the elderly gatekeeper through the open courtyard. He remained standing exactly where he had been since sunrise. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of long hours. The autumn sun had grown unexpectedly warm, and several more carriages were already approaching the entrance. She paused. Had anyone relieved him? Had anyone even offered him refreshment? A passing footman hurried toward the ballroom carrying crystal glasses. "Thomas," Eleanor called softly. "Has Mr. Wilcox eaten today?" The young servant blinked. "I don't believe so, Miss Hart." He hurried away before she could ask anything more. Eleanor looked toward the gate once again. The old man's hands trembled ever so slightly as he reached for the heavy iron latch. Without another thought, she turned back toward the kitchens, filled a simple glass with cool well water, and wrapped a clean cloth around it to keep it cold. She knew Lady Beatrice expected her elsewhere. She knew guests were arriving every minute. Still, she walked steadily toward the estate gates. She had no idea that dozens of unseen eyes were already watching. Titles often passed from father to son like polished heirlooms, carrying with them centuries of honor. Yet the burdens hidden beneath those titles were seldom inherited with ceremony. They arrived quietly, wrapped in responsibility, sacrifice, and expectations no ordinary man could escape. Edward Ashford, the Earl of Blackwood, understood that truth better than anyone. For nearly 3 years, rumors had painted him as an aloof nobleman who disliked society and avoided every ballroom in England. The stories were not entirely false. Since inheriting Blackwood Hall after his father's sudden death, Edward had devoted himself to rebuilding neglected villages, restoring struggling tenant farms, and settling debts left by careless estate managers. His days belonged to ledgers, court disputes, and endless journeys across his lands rather than glittering assemblies filled with practiced smiles. The invitations that crowded his writing desk rarely received replies. Marriage proposals arrived almost as frequently. Those received even less attention. His widowed aunt, Lady Margaret Blackwood, had grown increasingly impatient. "You require an heir," she reminded him each time they met. "The county needs its Earl, not a wandering steward forever inspecting barns and bridges." Edward merely smiled politely. "I require honesty far more than admiration." Lady Margaret sighed every time he answered the same way. The previous winter had changed him more than anyone realized. While traveling without ceremony through several tenant villages, Edward had witnessed how differently people behaved when they believed no nobleman stood before them. Some welcomed strangers without hesitation. Others ignored suffering they considered beneath notice. Those quiet observations lingered in his thoughts long after returning home. Since then, he had formed an unusual habit. Whenever possible, he visited neighboring estates disguised as an ordinary worker. Sometimes he appeared as a stable hand. Sometimes as a messenger. Today, he had chosen something even simpler. An elderly gatekeeper. With carefully altered clothing, silver dust brushed through his dark hair, a rough walking stick, and weathered gloves hiding the unmistakable hands of a gentleman, even long-time acquaintances would have struggled to recognize him. Only his trusted valet, Mr. Collins, knew the truth. "Your lordship," Collins had protested that morning while helping adjust the disguise. "Surely this has become unnecessary. Lady Beatrice expects the Earl himself." Edward fastened the worn coat without looking up. "Precisely. If she discovers, then she will discover that appearances deserve less trust than character." Collins smiled despite himself. "I suspect most guests will never notice the gatekeeper at all." Edward gave a quiet nod. "That is exactly what I wish to learn." Hour after hour he opened Ashcombe Hall's gates, greeting every carriage with practiced humility. Beautiful ladies swept past without meeting his eyes. Gentlemen discussed fortunes while brushing impatiently around him. Several guests complained that he opened the gates too slowly. One demanded he clean mud from expensive boots. Edward answered each request with calm courtesy. None recognized him. As the afternoon stretched onward, exhaustion settled into his shoulders. The disguise required more than altered clothing. It demanded patience. Yet the experiment had already confirmed something he had long suspected. Most people revealed their truest selves not before an earl, but before someone they believed held no importance at all. Then, across the courtyard, he noticed a young woman leaving the manor. She carried nothing more than a simple glass of water, and unlike every guest who had passed before her, she was walking directly toward him. The smallest acts of kindness are often offered without expectation. They are not performed for applause or reward, but because a compassionate heart cannot comfortably walk past another's quiet suffering. Yet such moments possess a remarkable power. They reveal character more honestly than any carefully rehearsed introduction ever could. Edward rested both hands upon the weathered gate as another carriage rolled through the entrance. The horses snorted impatiently, their hooves scattering loose gravel across the drive. As always, the passengers barely acknowledged the aging gatekeeper who had opened the estate for them. Only after the carriage disappeared toward the manor did the silence return. Edward flexed his aching fingers. The disguise had become more convincing than comfortable. Hours beneath the autumn sun had stiffened his shoulders, and the rough wool collar scratched constantly against his neck. Still, he remained where he was, determined to finish what he had begun. Soft footsteps approached across the gravel. He looked up. The young woman he had noticed moments earlier walked steadily toward him, carrying a simple glass wrapped in a clean linen cloth. Her modest sage-green dress lacked the embroidery worn by the ladies inside the house, yet she carried herself with quiet dignity rather than embarrassment. She stopped a respectful distance away. "Good afternoon," she said gently. Edward inclined his head. "Good afternoon, miss." She extended the glass toward him. "You have been standing here since morning." He blinked, genuinely surprised. "I have." A faint smile touched her lips. "I passed this gate several hours ago while collecting herbs from the garden." "You were standing here then as well?" Edward looked at the cool water before returning his gaze to her. "You needn't trouble yourself." "It isn't trouble." Her answer came so naturally that it seemed almost instinctive. "I thought you might be thirsty." For a long moment neither spoke. Inside the manor, laughter drifted faintly through the open windows, carried on the breeze with distant strains of violin music. Here at the gates, the world felt strangely peaceful. Edward accepted the glass carefully. The water was cool against his weathered gloves. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You are most welcome." She did not ask his name. She did not question how long he had worked there. Nor did she offer pity. Instead, she simply waited until he had taken several grateful drinks. "It is cold," Edward observed. "I wrapped the glass before bringing it outside," Eleanor replied. "The kitchen well keeps the water cool." Edward lowered the glass slowly. Most people would have walked past. She glanced toward the manor. "They are busy." "And you?" She looked almost puzzled by the question. "I noticed." Nothing more. No grand explanation. No attempt to appear virtuous. Simply, "I noticed." The words settled more deeply than she could possibly have imagined. Edward had spent months observing strangers. He had seen generosity offered only when influential eyes were watching. He had watched servants scolded over trivial mistakes while guests praised themselves for imagined kindness. Yet this young woman had walked away from an important gathering, not because anyone expected it, but because an unnoticed servant looked tired. Before Edward could speak again, hurried footsteps echoed from the front terrace. "Eleanor." Lady Beatrice's sharp voice cut across the courtyard. "There you are. The guests have been asking for refreshments, and instead of helping, you are standing here chatting with the gatekeeper." Several nearby visitors turned toward the commotion. Eleanor lowered her eyes respectfully. "I was only bringing him some water." Lady Beatrice's expression hardened. He is perfectly capable of doing his duty without distracting the household. Edward remained silent, but behind the disguise, his jaw tightened. For the first time that day, he found himself wondering not whether this quiet young woman deserved kindness, but whether everyone around her deserved her. A person's true worth is rarely discovered in grand ballrooms or beneath glittering chandeliers. It reveals itself in quieter places, where no applause is expected and no advantage can be gained. Those who recognize genuine kindness are often the ones who have spent enough time surrounded by pretense to know the difference. Lady Beatrice offered the assembled guests an apologetic smile. "I do hope you'll forgive the interruption," she said lightly. "Miss Hart has always been rather soft-hearted." A few ladies exchanged amused glances. One gentleman chuckled. What an unusual place to find conversation. Eleanor neither defended herself nor lowered her dignity. She simply accepted the empty glass from the elderly gatekeeper with the same calm expression she had worn from the beginning. "I should return to my duties," she said softly. Edward inclined his head. "Thank you again, miss." She smiled politely. "I hope the rest of your day is easier." Without waiting for praise or gratitude, she turned and walked back toward the manor. Edward watched until she disappeared through the side entrance. Only then did Mr. Collins quietly emerge from behind a row of clipped hedges, pretending to inspect a nearby carriage wheel. Anyone watching would have assumed he was merely another servant. "You've found someone interesting," Collins murmured. Edward kept his eyes fixed on the manor. "I found someone genuine." Collins smiled knowingly. "I suspected you might." Edward handed him the empty glass. "Did you see how the others reacted?" "I did." "They laughed because she offered water." Collins nodded. "They laughed because they believed the kindness had no value." Edward remained silent for several moments. "I have attended banquets with ministers and dukes," he finally said. "I have heard speeches about honor, charity, and Christian virtue." He glanced toward the manor. That young woman demonstrated more of all three in 60 seconds than most people manage in an entire lifetime. Collins looked toward the grand house. "Will you reveal yourself?" "Not yet." "Then what?" Edward's expression grew thoughtful. "I wish to know whether her kindness belongs only to strangers, or whether it guides every part of her life." Inside Ashcombe Hall, Eleanor resumed arranging refreshments as though nothing unusual had happened. Clara noticed her immediately. "So," she said with a playful smirk, "have you made friends with the gatekeeper?" Vivian laughed. "Perhaps he'll leave her the keys to the front gate in his will." Several nearby ladies joined the laughter. Eleanor simply placed another tray of teacups onto the table. "He looked tired." "He's employed to stand there," Clara replied. "If you begin caring for every servant, you'll never finish your own work." Eleanor looked toward the tall windows overlooking the entrance. "My father used to say that work never removes someone's humanity." The room fell briefly quiet. Vivian rolled her eyes. "Your father filled your head with impossible ideas." "Perhaps." Eleanor answered gently. "But they helped him remain a good man." Before either sister could respond, Lady Beatrice announced that the guests would soon gather in the grand drawing room. At precisely 3 o'clock, the long-awaited Earl of Blackwood was expected to arrive. Excitement spread through the manor almost instantly. Ladies hurried to mirrors. Gentlemen straightened their coats. Servants rushed to prepare the entrance. Only Eleanor frowned slightly. She glanced toward the distant estate gates. The elderly gatekeeper still stood alone beneath the stone arch, and for reasons she could not explain. She hoped someone would finally allow the old man to rest. The greatest revelations seldom arrive with trumpets or ceremony. More often, they appear at the precise moment when pride expects applause and humility expects nothing at all. Truth has an unsettling habit of entering quietly before changing everything. The drawing room of Ashcombe Hall shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. Sunlight spilled through towering windows, catching the polished oak floor where servants made their final preparations. Fresh flowers filled silver vases, musicians stood ready with their instruments, and conversations rose into an eager murmur. Lady Beatrice surveyed the room with satisfaction. "The Earl should arrive at any moment," she announced. "Please remember yourselves." Clara adjusted the sapphire ribbon woven into her hair. Vivian smoothed invisible wrinkles from her silk gloves. Several mothers whispered last-minute advice into their daughters' ears. Each convinced Fortune would smile upon her family before the afternoon ended. Only Eleanor remained near the refreshment table, quietly ensuring every guest had tea before they asked. She had no expectation of meeting the Earl. In truth, she preferred remaining unnoticed. Outside the manor, Edward slowly removed the worn leather gloves that completed his disguise. Mr. Collins approached carrying a carefully folded black coat embroidered with the discreet crest of Blackwood. "It is nearly time, my lord." Edward accepted the coat but hesitated. His thoughts remained fixed on the young woman who had offered him water without knowing who he was. "I have visited many estates this year," he said quietly. "And I have been greeted with rehearsed smiles, exaggerated courtesy, and carefully measured admiration." Collins nodded. But today. Edward looked toward the manor. Edward entered with calm confidence, acknowledging respectful bows with a courteous nod rather than theatrical grandeur. Lady Beatrice stepped forward first. "My lord, Ashcombe Hall is honoured by your presence." "The honour is mine, Lady Beatrice." His voice was warm but reserved. As introductions began, Clara and Vivian offered graceful curtsies exactly as they had rehearsed. Edward greeted them politely. Nothing more. Lady Beatrice continued presenting neighbouring families one after another. Edward listened patiently, though his attention wandered. He searched the room. Not for beauty. Not for wealth. For someone else. Finally, near the refreshment table, he found her. Eleanor looked up. For a brief moment their eyes met. Something about the Earl seemed strangely familiar. She could not explain why. Perhaps it was the calm grey eyes. Perhaps the quiet way he observed the room instead of demanding its attention. Or perhaps she had seen those eyes only minutes earlier beneath a weathered cap at the estate gate. Before she could dismiss the impossible thought, Edward excused himself from the receiving line, ignoring the curious glances of every guest, ignoring the carefully prepared introductions still waiting. He walked directly across the drawing room, toward Eleanor. The entire room fell silent. Lady Beatrice stared in disbelief. Clara's confident smile disappeared. Vivian tightened her grip on her fan. Edward stopped before Eleanor. His expression softened into the faintest smile. "Miss," he said gently, "I believe I still owe you thanks for the glass of water you offered at the gate." A stunned silence swept across the room. Every face turned toward Eleanor. And in that instant, she realized exactly who the old gatekeeper had truly been. There are moments when a room full of people becomes quieter than an empty church. Such silence is born not from peace, but from shattered certainty. One unexpected truth can undo years of carefully cultivated pride, revealing how poorly appearances have judged the human heart. No one in the drawing room moved. Lady Beatrice stared at the Earl as though she had misunderstood his words. Clara's smile faded completely. Vivian lowered her fan by a fraction. Even the musicians stood motionless. Edward continued looking only at Eleanor. She remained speechless, the memory of the weary gatekeeper standing beneath the estate arch flashing through her mind. "It was you," she whispered. A faint smile touched his face. "It was. You were the gatekeeper. For most of today." A ripple of astonished whispers swept through the guests. The Earl? In disguise? Impossible. Lady Beatrice recovered first. "My lord," she said with an uneasy laugh, "surely this has all been a harmless amusement." Edward turned toward her. It was neither amusement nor accident. His calm voice carried effortlessly across the room. "I wish to see how people treated those they believed had nothing to offer." The whispers stopped. Every guest suddenly remembered the elderly gatekeeper they had ignored only an hour earlier. Edward continued. Many passed without acknowledgement. His gaze rested briefly on several gentlemen. Some complained. It shifted toward a few ladies. Others spoke as though I were invisible. No one met his eyes. Finally, he looked back at Eleanor. Only one person stopped. Eleanor wished every pair of eyes were not upon her. "I merely brought you water." "You brought kindness." Edward's reply was immediate. "There is a difference." Lady Beatrice stepped forward again, forcing another polished smile. "My lord, Eleanor has always possessed a tender heart. I am pleased her small gesture impressed you." Edward regarded her quietly. Was it encouraged? The question caught her completely unprepared. "I beg your pardon." When Miss Hart brought water to an elderly servant, did anyone commend her? Lady Beatrice hesitated. "Well, there were more pressing matters. I observed otherwise." His words remained courteous. Their meaning did not. "I observed laughter." The drawing room became painfully still. Clara looked toward the floor. Vivian folded her hands tightly together. Edward spoke without raising his voice. Compassion should never become an object of ridicule. No one answered. After a long silence, Edward turned once more toward Eleanor. "I should like to thank you properly." "There is no need, my lord." "I believe there is." Before anyone could interrupt, He offered his arm. "Would you walk through the gardens with me?" A collective gasp spread through the room. Lady Beatrice's expression paled. The afternoon's carefully arranged introductions had vanished in an instant. The Earl had ignored every celebrated beauty to invite the quiet poor relation everyone overlooked. Eleanor hesitated, not because she feared him, but because she feared what accepting might cause. She glanced toward Lady Beatrice, whose smile had disappeared entirely. Then she looked back at Edward. His expression carried neither command nor expectation, only sincere respect. Slowly, she placed her hand upon his offered arm. "I would be honored." As they walked together toward the terrace doors, whispers erupted behind them. Some guests watched with disbelief, others with envy, a few with growing shame. Yet hidden among those astonished faces, one gentleman's expression darkened. Sir Reginald Hawthorne, whose family had long expected an alliance with the Earl, watched Eleanor leave at Edward's side. His jaw tightened. "This," he murmured under his breath, "will not end here." Justice seldom arrives in a single dramatic stroke. More often, it begins with one person choosing truth over convenience. When that choice is made by someone with the power to change lives, every hidden motive is brought into the light. The gardens of Ashcombe Hall stretched beyond the terrace like a painted landscape. Gravel paths wound between carefully clipped hedges, late blooming roses filled the cool afternoon air with fragrance, and a small stone fountain murmured beneath the branches of ancient elms. For the first few moments, neither Edward nor Eleanor spoke. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. Edward finally broke it. "I hope my disguise did not offend you." Eleanor looked at him with quiet sincerity. "It surprised me." "I imagine it did." "But no." She smiled faintly. "It explained something." Edward raised an eyebrow. "You listened more than you spoke." She continued walking. "You thanked every servant. You never acted like someone trying to impress anyone." She looked toward the fountain. "I only wondered why a gatekeeper carried himself like a gentleman." Edward laughed softly. The sound was genuine, free from the restraint he usually carried. "You noticed more than I expected." "I observe people." "So I discovered." They reached a wooden bench overlooking the gardens. Edward remained standing. "I have visited many houses disguised as an ordinary servant." Eleanor looked surprised. "So it was not only today?" "No." "And were people always the same?" Edward became thoughtful. "Almost always." He looked directly at her. "Until today." Before Eleanor could answer, hurried footsteps echoed across the gravel path. Lady Beatrice approached, accompanied by Clara, Vivian, and Sir Reginald Hawthorne. "My lord," Lady Beatrice said, forcing composure, "I feared we had inconvenienced you. Everyone is waiting inside." Edward turned calmly. "I wish to enjoy a few moments of fresh air." Sir Reginald stepped forward with a courteous bow that barely concealed his irritation. "My lord, surely one conversation with Miss Hart is enough. The guests have travelled great distances hoping for your acquaintance." Edward regarded him steadily. "And why should distance determine whom I choose to speak with?" Reginald's smile stiffened. "I merely thought, a gentleman of your rank should be introduced properly." Edward's voice remained perfectly calm. "I have already been introduced." His eyes shifted toward Eleanor. "Long before anyone realized who I was." An uncomfortable silence followed. Lady Beatrice attempted another smile. "Eleanor has always tried to be helpful." Edward answered without looking away from Eleanor. "Kindness is not something one merely tries. It is something one lives." Those simple words carried more weight than any public rebuke. Several nearby guests, who had quietly wandered into the gardens, lowered their eyes in embarrassment. Edward turned toward everyone gathered. "There is something I should make clear." Every conversation stopped. "I did not disguise myself to embarrass anyone." He paused. "I came searching for honesty." His gaze rested briefly upon the assembled company. "I found very little." Then he looked at Eleanor. "Except here." The words settled over the gardens like complete silence. Lady Beatrice's face flushed. Clara and Vivian could think of nothing to say. Sir Reginald's hands clenched behind his back. For the first time in years, The admiration of an earl had been earned not by beauty, not by wealth, not by noble birth, but by a single glass of water offered without expectation. And in that very moment, Edward made a decision that would change Eleanor's future forever. He turned to her and said quietly, "Miss Hart, there is something important I wish to ask you. Love is rarely born from a single extraordinary moment. More often, it grows from many quiet truths gathered together until one day they become impossible to ignore. The heart recognizes what pride cannot, and when that recognition finally comes, it asks only for honesty." The garden remained still. Even the breeze seemed to pause among the roses as Eleanor looked into Edward's calm grey eyes. "You wish to ask me something, my lord?" Edward nodded. "Yes." His voice carried none of the authority expected of an earl. Only sincerity. "Would you accompany me to Blackwood Hall tomorrow?" The unexpected question left everyone speechless. Lady Beatrice stared in disbelief. Sir Reginald stepped forward. "My lord, surely that would be inappropriate." Edward turned toward him. "I have not finished." Reginald reluctantly fell silent. Edward looked back at Eleanor. "My aunt, Lady Margaret, has long insisted that I choose a wife." A murmur spread through the guests. Edward continued calmly. "I believed I was searching for beauty." He shook his head gently. "Then I believed I sought intelligence." His eyes never left Eleanor. "But today I realized I have been searching for something far rarer." Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. A heart that remains kind even when no reward is possible. The words seemed to hang in the autumn air. "I do not yet ask for your hand," Edward said honestly. "Such a promise deserves more than a single afternoon." Relief and admiration crossed Eleanor's face simultaneously. "Instead, I ask whether you would allow me the privilege of knowing you properly." The garden fell completely silent. No dramatic declaration. No hurried proposal. Only respect. Only patience. Only truth. Eleanor lowered her eyes for a moment. She thought of her parents. She remembered her father's quiet advice. Never trust the man who notices only your appearance. Trust the one who notices your character. Slowly she looked back at Edward. "I would like that very much." For the first time that afternoon, Edward smiled without restraint. It was neither triumphant nor proud. Simply happy. Nearby, Lady Margaret Blackwood had quietly entered the gardens after hearing the commotion. She had witnessed the final moments without interruption. Approaching Eleanor, she studied the young woman with thoughtful eyes. "So," she said warmly, "you are the lady who offered my nephew a glass of water." Eleanor blushed. "I didn't know who he was." Lady Margaret smiled. "That is precisely why he has spoken of no one else since entering the house." She gently took Eleanor's hands. "My dear, wealth attracts admiration. Titles attract ambition. But kindness—" She glanced affectionately toward Edward. "Kindness attracts the right people." Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her confidence entirely gone. "Miss Hart." Her voice was softer than Eleanor had ever heard. "I fear I have not always treated you as I should." Eleanor met her eyes without bitterness. "We cannot change yesterday." Lady Beatrice lowered her head. "No, but perhaps." Eleanor offered a gentle smile. "We can begin with tomorrow." The simple forgiveness humbled everyone listening. Even Sir Reginald quietly bowed before leaving the gardens, recognizing that no rivalry could overcome what had naturally grown between the Earl and the woman whose compassion had asked for nothing in return. As the afternoon sun settled lower across Ashcombe Hall, the whispers of envy slowly transformed into conversations of admiration. For the first time that day, people spoke less about the Earl of Blackwood, and far more about the quiet young woman whose single act of kindness had changed every heart that witnessed it. Some stories are remembered because kingdoms rise or wars are won. Others endure because they remind us that the smallest kindness can quietly accomplish what power, wealth, and ambition never could. Long after grand celebrations are forgotten, people remember the heart that chose compassion when no one was watching. The following morning dawned beneath a clear autumn sky. Mist drifted gently across the fields surrounding Ashcombe Hall as servants prepared carriages in the courtyard. Unlike the previous day's excitement, the estate felt peaceful. The hurried conversations and calculated introductions had disappeared, replaced by an unusual calm. Eleanor stood beside the front steps with a small travelling case at her feet. She had packed only what she truly needed: a few dresses, several beloved books, and the silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Lady Beatrice approached slowly. For the first time in many years, there was no authority in her voice, only regret. "Eleanor." She paused before continuing. "I spent too many years measuring people by what they could offer this family." Her eyes grew moist. "In doing so, I failed to see the greatest treasure already living under my own roof." Eleanor stepped forward and embraced her gently. "I have never wished you unhappiness." Lady Beatrice returned the embrace with trembling hands. "Thank you for giving me the chance to become a better woman." Nearby, Clara and Vivian approached with hesitant smiles. "We judged you unfairly," Clara admitted. Vivian nodded. "We thought being admired was the greatest achievement." Eleanor smiled warmly. "It is far better to be respected." The sisters exchanged a glance before embracing her, their rivalry finally replaced by genuine affection. At that moment, Edward's carriage rolled into the courtyard. He stepped down, dressed simply despite his rank, and walked toward Eleanor. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all, my lord." He smiled. "I believe we agreed yesterday that you should call me Edward." A faint blush colored Eleanor's cheeks. Then, "Good morning, Edward." His smile widened. "And good morning, Eleanor." Lady Margaret watched from the carriage with quiet satisfaction. "I suspect Blackwood Hall has been empty for far too long," she said. Edward looked at Eleanor. "I cannot promise a perfect life. There will be responsibilities. There will be difficult seasons. There will be days when the estate demands more than either of us expects." He gently offered his hand. "But I promise this. You will always be valued. You will always be heard. And you will never again wonder whether you belong." Tears shimmered in Eleanor's eyes. For years she had searched for a place where kindness was not mistaken for weakness. She realized she had finally found it. She placed her hand in his. "I would like nothing more." As the carriage departed Ashcombe Hall, the morning sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the long road stretching toward Blackwood Hall. The journey ahead was not simply the beginning of a romance. It was the beginning of a partnership built upon trust, quiet understanding, and the simple belief that true nobility is measured not by a title, but by the compassion one shows to others. Years later, visitors to Blackwood Hall often remarked upon the warmth that filled the great house. They spoke of an earl who treated every servant with dignity and of a countess who knew every gardener, maid, stable hand, and gatekeeper by name. They never forgot birthdays, never ignored hardship, and never allowed rank to stand above kindness. And whenever someone asked the Earl how he had known he had found the right woman, he would smile toward his wife before answering. "I recognized her long before she recognized me. She offered a weary gatekeeper a simple glass of water, expecting nothing in return. In that moment, I learned everything I needed to know about her heart." For in a world captivated by wealth and appearances, it was not beauty that changed an earl's life. It was kindness.